There are moments in history when mercy appears where logic says it should not, when kindness walks through doors that fear has locked, when someone broken by the past is suddenly called forward into a future they never imagined possible. This is one of those stories. It begins not with triumph, but with ash, not with celebration, but with silence, not with a throne, but with a crippled boy, a hidden life, and a king who refused to forget. Grace often arrives where shame is settled in. And in ancient Israel, during the blood-soaked years following civil war, grace arrived at a table set for the forgotten. Chapter 1. A house in ruins. The house of Saul had fallen, not slowly, not quietly. It collapsed like a tower struck at its foundation. And when the dust cleared, there was almost nothing left. King Saul, the first anointed ruler of Israel, was dead. His sons were dead. His army was scattered. His legacy, once golden, was now stained with madness, jealousy, and the tragic arc of a man who had lost the favor of God. The Philistines had come like locusts. They swept across the hills of Gilboa, their chariots grinding through the dirt roads, their swords flashing in the sunlight. Saul's army tried to hold. They fought with desperation, but desperation is not strategy. One by one, the warriors fell. The king's sons fell, and finally, wounded and surrounded, Saul himself fell on his own sword rather than be captured alive. The news traveled fast. In the royal household, panic erupted. Servants fled. Advisors disappeared into the countryside. Relatives gathered what they could carry and scattered like seeds in a storm. To be connected to Saul now was not an honor. It was a death sentence. David had been anointed king long before Saul's death. He had been hunted by Saul, driven into caves, forced to live among enemies. But David had never stopped being loyal to the throne itself. He had never raised his hand against the anointed king. And now, with Saul gone, David was the rightful heir. But the family of Saul did not see it that way. They saw only danger. In the ancient world, when a new king rose, the old royal line was often erased. Wives, children, distant cousins. Anyone with a claim to the throne could be seen as a threat. It was not cruelty. It was survival. It was politics written in blood. History was filled with such purges. When dynasties changed hands, the former royal families rarely survived. It was understood that to allow them to live was to plant seeds of future rebellion. A surviving prince could rally loyalists. A remaining heir could become a symbol for the discontented. And so kings acted preemptively, not out of personal hatred necessarily, but out of cold political calculation. The household of Saul understood this reality all too well. They had seen how kingdoms operated. They knew the unspoken rules of power, and now, with David ascending to the throne, they expected the worst. So they ran. Some fled north toward the territories still loyal to Saul's memory. Others went east, crossing the Jordan River into lands less controlled by David's authority. Still others simply vanished into the countryside, taking new names, bearing their royal connections, and hoping that distance and time would erase the threat they represented. And among those who fled was a young boy named Mephibosheth. Chapter 2. The Child Who Fell. Mephibosheth was only 5 years old when the news came. His father Jonathan was dead. His grandfather Saul was dead. The kingdom was collapsing, and the household was in chaos. His nurse, perhaps a servant, perhaps a relative, grabbed the boy and ran. She did not stop to pack. She did not pause to plan. She simply ran, clutching the child in her arms, her heart pounding, her mind racing with fear. The roads were crowded with refugees, other members of the household, servants, guards who had abandoned their posts, farmers fleeing the expected violence. all of them moving in the same direction, away from the center of power, away from Jerusalem, and away from whatever judgment was coming. The nurse held Mephibosheth tightly. He was crying, confused, asking questions she could not answer. Where were they going? When would they come back? Where was his father? She did not tell him the truth. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that his entire world had ended, that his father would never return, that the palace he had known, the life he had lived, was gone forever? She just kept running, and then she fell. Maybe it was the uneven ground. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the weight of the boy combined with the speed of her panic. Maybe she was jostled by the crowd of other fleeing refugees. Whatever the reason, she stumbled, and when she did, Mephibosheth fell from her arms. He hit the ground hard. The impact was devastating. His small body crumpled, his legs twisting beneath him at unnatural angles. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He screamed, a sound that cut through the chaos of the fleeing crowd. The nurse scrambled to her feet, her own knees scraped and bleeding. She reached for the boy, panic rising in her throat. Around them, people barely paused. Everyone was focused on their own survival, their own escape. No one stopped to help. No one had time. She lifted Mephibosheth back into her arms. He was still crying, clutching at his legs, his face twisted in agony. She could feel the unnatural angles of his limbs, could sense that something terrible had happened. But there was no time to stop, no time to assess, no time to do anything but keep moving. If they stayed on the road, if they slowed down, they risked being caught. They risked being identified. When they risked everything, so she kept running. The boy's cries gradually faded into whimpers, then to shocked silence. But the damage was done. The fall had shattered bones in both of his feet and legs. In a world without modern medicine, without proper surgical intervention, without even a basic understanding of how to properly set complex fractures, the injuries healed poorly. The bones knit together crookedly, the tendons shortened, the muscles atrophied. By the time they reached safety weeks later, in a distant town far from Jerusalem, it was clear that Mephibosheth would never walk normally again. His legs, broken and improperly healed, left him crippled. In a world where strength and mobility determine status, where a man's ability to fight or work defined his worth, Mephibosheth was marked from that moment forward. He would not be a warrior like his father. He would not lead armies like his grandfather. He would not stand tall in the courts of kings. He would be the crippled son of a dead prince, hidden away in a forgotten town, living in the shadow of a family that no longer existed. Chapter 3. Living in Hiding. The years passed slowly in Lodabar. The name itself means no pasture. It was a place of barrenness, a town on the edge of civilization, where people went when they had nowhere else to go. It was dry, distant, and unremarkable. The kind of place you could disappear into and never be found. And that was exactly what Mephibosheth did. He lived quietly in the household of Mashir, son of Ammiel. Mashir was a man of some means, enough to take in the displaced grandson of a king, enough to provide shelter and food. But it was not charity born of sentimentality. It was obligation. It was loyalty to the memory of Saul and Jonathan. And perhaps it was also insurance. If political winds shifted again, having protected a royal heir might prove valuable. Mephibosheth grew up in this household, but he grew up knowing he was different. Other boys ran through the streets, played at being soldiers, helped their fathers in the fields. He watched from doorways and windows. He moved slowly, painfully, his twisted legs requiring support, requiring assistance, requiring constant accommodation. He kept his head down. He did not speak of his lineage. He did not mention his grandfather's throne or his father's courage. To do so would be to invite danger. To do so would be to remind the world that he was a descendant of Saul and therefore, in the eyes of many, a potential threat. Word had reached Lo-debar over the years about David's reign. The new king had united the tribes. He had defeated the Philistines decisively. He had captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. He had brought stability to a land that had known only chaos. By all accounts, David was a good king, a strong king, a king blessed by God. But to Mephibosheth, these reports only deepened his fear. A strong king was a secure king, and a secure king had no reason to tolerate potential rivals. Every year that passed without incident was, in Mephibosheth's mind, not a sign of safety, but merely a delay of the inevitable. So he lived as though he did not exist. His days were marked by routine. He woke, he ate, he moved slowly through the hours, relying on others for support. He helped where he could, mending things with his hands, offering advice, contributing what little he was able to contribute. But always, always, there was the underlying sense that he was a burden, that he was taking up space, that he was living on borrowed time in more ways than one. His disability was not just physical, it shaped how he saw himself. He believed he was less. He believed he was broken. He believed that the fall that had crippled his legs had also crippled his future. Shame became his constant companion, not because anyone told him he was worthless, but because the world around him seemed to confirm it every single day. He could not work like other men. He could not defend himself. He could not provide in the ways that mattered. And so he withdrew further into himself, into the quiet resignation that this was all his life would ever be. The people of Lo-debar were not unkind, and they nodded to him in the streets. They made small talk when they encountered him, but there was always a distance. He was the crippled stranger living in Mashir's house. He was the quiet one who never spoke of where he came from. He was, in every practical sense, a ghost. He did not expect rescue. He did not hope for restoration. He simply survived day by day in a town called No Pasture, waiting for nothing. The loneliness was perhaps the heaviest burden. He had no peers, no true friends. The young men of the town had their own circles, their own camaraderie built around shared labor and shared experiences. Mephibosheth could not participate. He could not join the harvest crews. He could not go on hunting parties. He could not even sit comfortably in the informal gatherings where men traded stories and jokes after the day's work was done. He was always apart, always separate, always other. At night, lying in his small room in Mashir's house, he sometimes thought about his father. Jonathan had been a hero. Jonathan had been brave, skilled with a bow, beloved by the people. Jonathan had been the kind of man songs were written about, and Mephibosheth was his son. But what kind of legacy was that? What did it mean to be the son of a hero when you could not even walk properly? What did it mean to carry a famous name when you had to hide that name every single day? The weight of it pressed down on him, the sense that he had disappointed not just his father's memory, but some fundamental expectation of what a man should be. He knew it was not rational. He knew the fall had not been his fault. He had been a child. But shame is not rational. Shame does not care about circumstances. Shame simply settles in and makes itself at home. And so the years continued. 5 years became 10. 10 became 15. Mephibosheth moved from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, all within the confines of Lo-debar, all within the narrow boundaries of a life defined by limitation. He married. He had a son named Micah. These were small joys, small anchors of normalcy. But even these blessings were tinged with sadness. He watched his son grow, watched him learn to walk with ease, watched him run and jump and do all the things Mephibosheth could not do. And while he loved his son fiercely, there was also a quiet grief that he could not be the kind of father he wanted to be. He could not chase Micah through the streets. He could not lift him onto his shoulders. He could not teach him to fight or hunt or do any of the things fathers typically passed on to their sons. He provided what he could: love, presence, wisdom gained from years of quiet observation. But it never felt like enough. And always beneath everything was the fear that someday someone would remember. Someone would make the connection. Someone would whisper to King David that Saul's grandson was alive, living in Lodabar. And then the soldiers would come. He had nightmares about it sometimes. The sound of marching feet, the knock on the door, the rough hands dragging him before the king, the sword falling. He never told anyone about these dreams. What would be the point? Fear was his private burden, carried silently, ever accepted as the price of survival. Chapter 4. David remembers a promise. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, King David sat on the throne of Israel. He had united the tribes. He had defeated the Philistines. He had brought the ark of God back to the city. He had established his rule with wisdom, strength, and the favor of heaven. The people loved him. The kingdom was at peace. And yet, in the quiet moments, David's mind drifted backward. He thought of Jonathan. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had been David's closest friend. They had made a covenant together, a bond deeper than politics, stronger than blood. It was not a casual friendship. It was the kind of connection that shapes a life, that leaves a permanent mark on the soul. David remembered the first time they had truly seen each other. It was after David had killed Goliath. When the shepherd boy was brought before King Saul, Jonathan had been there, watching this young man who had done what trained warriors would not do. And something had happened in that moment, a recognition, a kinship. The text says Jonathan's soul was knit to David's soul. It was immediate, it was profound, and it changed both of their lives. Jonathan had protected David when Saul's jealousy turned to murderous rage. Jonathan had warned David when his father planned to kill him. Jonathan had risked his own safety, his own relationship with his father, his own claim to the throne, all to keep David alive. They had made a covenant. They had sworn before God that their loyalty to each other would extend to their descendants, that no matter what happened, no matter how politics shifted, they would protect each other's families. And then Jonathan had died. David had mourned deeply. He had written a lament, one of the most beautiful expressions of grief in all of Scripture. "How the mighty have fallen," he had written. "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women." But mourning is not the same as remembering. Grief is not the same as action. And for years, David had been consumed with the demands of kingship, building a capital, establishing a government, fighting wars, consolidating power. There had been no time to dwell on the past until now. One day, sitting in the palace, David turned to his servants and asked a question that no one expected. "Is there anyone left from the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" The room grew quiet, and the servants exchanged glances. Kindness to the house of Saul? Why would the king do such a thing? Saul had tried to kill him. Saul's family had been his enemies. Saul had driven him into the wilderness, forced him to live in caves, hunted him like an animal for years. And yet here was David asking not about vengeance, but about mercy. Not about eliminating threats, but about honoring a promise. It was unusual. It was unexpected. It was, to the servants standing in that room, almost incomprehensible. Kings did not usually ask such questions. Kings did not usually seek out the remnants of previous dynasties to bless them. The entire logic of royal succession argued against it. Safety demanded that old claims be extinguished, not nurtured. But David was not asking for political advice. He was asking about a covenant. He was asking about loyalty that transcended politics. He was asking about a promise he had made to his friend, and he intended to keep it. One of the servants spoke up. There was a man named Ziba, a former servant of Saul's household. He might know if anyone remained. David summoned him immediately. When Ziba arrived, he was nervous. Being summoned by the king was never a comfortable experience, especially for someone who had once served the previous dynasty. He entered the throne room cautiously, bowing low, keeping his eyes down. David did not waste time with pleasantries. "Are you Ziba?" "I am your servant," Ziba replied carefully. David leaned forward. "Is there anyone left from Saul's house? Anyone at all?" Ziba hesitated. This was dangerous territory. And to reveal information about surviving members of Saul's family could be seen as disloyalty to David. But to lie to the king was even more dangerous. He chose his words carefully. "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet." The detail about the disability was deliberate. Ziba was making it clear that this was not a viable threat. A crippled man could not lead a rebellion. A crippled man could not rally an army. A crippled man posed no danger to the throne. But David's response was not what Ziba expected. David's face changed. For a moment the mask of kingship slipped, and there was just a man remembering his friend. Jonathan had a son. Jonathan's line continued. There was someone left to whom he could show the kindness he had promised. "Where is he?" David asked. Ziba swallowed. "In Lo-debar, at the house of Mashir, son of Amiel." Lo-debar, the middle of nowhere. The kind of place you went to hide. The kind of place you went when you were afraid. David stood. "Bring him to me." Chapter 5. The Summons. When the messengers arrived in Lo-debar, Mephibosheth's world tilted. It was an ordinary day. He was sitting in the courtyard of Mashir's house, working on a small repair job, when he heard the commotion in the street. The sound of horses, the sound of voices, the sound of authority. His heart began to race even before he knew why. Mashir came into the courtyard, his face pale. Behind him were men in the livery of the king, royal messengers, armed, official. They had come. After all these years, after all this time, they had finally come. "Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan?" one of the messengers asked formally. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. He managed to nod. "You are summoned to Jerusalem to appear before King David." The words hung in the air. Summoned. Jerusalem. King David. This was it. This was the moment he had feared his entire life. David had finally remembered. David had finally decided to finish what political necessity demanded. The last living son of Jonathan, the last threat connecting the house of Saul to the throne, was being called in to be removed. Mashir tried to interject. "Perhaps there has been a mistake." "Perhaps there is no mistake," the messenger said firmly. "The king has called for him. We leave tomorrow." That night Mephibosheth barely slept. He said goodbye to his wife, to his son. He tried to be brave, tried to hide his fear, but they could all see it. They all knew what this meant. His wife held him and wept. "Maybe it will be all right," she whispered. "Maybe the king means no harm." But they both knew she was trying to convince herself as much as him. In the morning, the messengers were ready. They had brought a cart for him, understanding that he could not travel on horseback. Even this small accommodation felt ominous. They were making sure he arrived. They were making sure he could not escape. The journey to Jerusalem was long and humiliating. Mephibosheth sat in the back of the cart, his twisted legs stretched out before him, his body jolting with every bump in the road. The messengers rode alongside, silent and professional. They did not speak to him. They did not explain. They simply escorted him like a prisoner being transported to judgment. He watched the landscape change as they traveled. In the barren hills of Lo-Debar gave way to more fertile land. They passed through villages and towns. They crossed rivers, and with each mile Jerusalem drew closer. He had never been to Jerusalem. He had been too young when his family fled. All he knew of it came from reports and stories. It was the city David had conquered, the city that had become the heart of the kingdom, the city where power resided, and now he was going there to die. At night when they camped, he lay awake staring at the stars. He thought about his father. He wondered if Jonathan would be ashamed of him. He wondered if his father had imagined in those final moments on the battlefield that his son would end up like this, crippled, afraid, summoned to an execution. He thought about his own son, Micah. What would become of the boy? And would the king's vengeance extend even to the next generation? Or would Micah be spared because he was too young, too insignificant to matter? These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no comfort, no resolution. As they approached Jerusalem, the roads became more crowded. Merchants traveling to the capital, pilgrims coming to worship, soldiers on patrol. The city itself rose before them, walls gleaming in the sunlight, gates standing open but guarded. They passed through without incident. The messengers clearly had authority. Guards nodded them through, and then they were inside, moving through streets Mephibosheth had only imagined, heading toward the palace. When he finally arrived at the palace, the weight of the moment crushed him. The building was enormous, grand, intimidating. Everything about it spoke of power and permanence. This was not just a house. This was the seat of a kingdom. This was where decisions of life and death were made. The guards led him into the throne room. The walls were high. The ceiling echoed with voices. Courtiers and officials moved about conducting the business of the kingdom. And at the far end of the hall, seated on the throne, was King David. Mephibosheth had never seen David before. He had imagined him countless times, imagined him as a giant, as a warrior, as a figure of terror. But the man on the throne looked almost ordinary, older than Mephibosheth expected, lines on his face, gray in his beard. But the eyes were what caught Mephibosheth's attention. They were intelligent, piercing, the eyes of someone who saw everything. And right now, they were looking directly at him. Mephibosheth fell to the ground. He did not kneel gracefully. He collapsed face down, arms outstretched, trembling. His legs, useless as always, splayed awkwardly beneath him. He could not look up. He could not speak. He simply waited for the sword to fall. The throne room continued its business around him, but he heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to this moment, this spot on the floor, this final breath before the end. Then he heard footsteps. Someone was approaching, coming down from the throne, walking toward him. Mephibosheth, a voice said gently. The sound of his own name startled him. It was not harsh. It was not angry. It was almost kind. He forced himself to speak, his voice barely audible. I am your servant. Chapter 6, Mercy at the Throne. David stood before the prostrate man and felt a wave of emotion he had not anticipated. This was Jonathan's son, the boy Jonathan had loved, the child Jonathan had held. And now here he was, broken, terrified, expecting death. David's mind flashed back to conversations with Jonathan. His friend had spoken of his son sometimes in the brief moments of peace between battles. Jonathan had loved the boy fiercely and wanted so much for him, had dreamed of the kind of man he might become, and now, because of politics and fear and the cruel mathematics of power, that boy had grown up in hiding, believing himself to be hunted. David's heart broke. "Do not be afraid," he said. Mephibosheth's body tensed at the words. Do not be afraid. How could he not be afraid? He was the grandson of Saul. He was the last living reminder of a dynasty that had fallen. He was a threat, whether he wanted to be or not. But David continued, his voice steady and warm. "I will show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan." Mephibosheth's mind struggled to process the words. Kindness for Jonathan's sake? Was this some kind of trick, some cruel joke before the execution? But David kept speaking, and with every word the impossible became real. "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. All the fields, all the property. It is yours again, and you will always eat at my table." The throne room seemed to spin. Mephibosheth's thoughts tumbled over each other, unable to form coherence. Not execution, not exile, not even tolerance. Restoration, invitation, a place at the king's table. Around the throne room, courtiers had stopped their conversations. Officials had paused their business. Everyone was watching. This was unprecedented. This was extraordinary. David motioned to his servants. "Help him up." Hands reached down, gently lifting Mephibosheth from the floor. He stood shakily, his legs barely supporting him, his whole body trembling. He looked at David, really looked at him for the first time. And what he saw in the king's face was not anger, or calculation, or political maneuvering. It was genuine compassion. Mephibosheth bowed his head, his voice shaking. "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" The phrase was not false humility. It was genuine. In that moment, Mephibosheth believed every word. He saw himself as worthless, as beneath notice, as something to be discarded. A dead dog. That was how he understood his place in the world. A dead dog had no value. A dead dog could not serve. A dead dog was less than nothing, not even alive enough to be useful. That was how deeply shame had rooted itself in his identity. But David's face changed. He stepped closer, looking Mephibosheth directly in the eyes. "You are the son of my covenant brother," David said firmly. "You are Jonathan's son. That is who you are. And I made a promise." He turned to the assembled court. "Let it be known, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, is restored. All that belonged to Saul is his. He will live in Jerusalem, and he will eat at my table as one of my own sons." Then David called for Ziba. The servant appeared quickly, bowing low. David's instructions were clear and detailed. "You and your sons and your servants will work the land that belonged to Saul. The produce will support Mephibosheth and his household, but Mephibosheth himself will always eat at my table." Ziba bowed. "As the king commands." Mephibosheth stood there, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. His entire life, every assumption he had made, every fear he had carried, every belief about his identity, it was all being rewritten in this moment. He had come expecting death and received life. He had come expecting judgment and received mercy. He had come carrying shame and was being offered honor. Chapter 7. A New Identity. The adjustment was not immediate. In the days following the throne room encounter, Mephibosheth moved through his new life in a kind of daze. He was given rooms in the palace. Servants attended to his needs, and he was provided with clothes befitting his new status. Everything had changed, but inside he still felt like the man from Lo-Debar, the crippled grandson hiding in no pasture, the one who did not belong. The first time he was called to dinner at the king's table, His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his cup. He sat among David's sons, grown men, warriors, princes, and felt like an imposter. They were polite. They welcomed him, but he could feel their curiosity. Who was this crippled stranger their father had elevated? Why was he here? David, at the head of the table, seemed to sense his discomfort. He engaged Mephibosheth in conversation, asking about his life, his family, his son Micah. Nothing heavy, nothing that required Mephibosheth to perform, just genuine interest. Slowly, over the course of that first meal, something inside Mephibosheth began to soften. These men were not his enemies. David was not his executioner. This was real. This was actually happening. Still, old patterns are hard to break. That night, alone in his room, he waited for the other shoe to drop. He waited for someone to come and tell him it was all a mistake. He waited for the conditions to be revealed. Surely David wanted something in return. Surely there was a price, but no one came. The next day was the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every evening, without exception, he sat at the king's table and ate alongside David's sons. He listened to their conversations. He watched the way David led with wisdom and grace. He saw the king laugh with his children, discuss matters of state, settle disputes, offer counsel, and slowly, something inside him began to shift. One evening, several weeks after his arrival, one of David's younger sons asked him about his injury. It was an innocent question, asked without malice, just curiosity. Mephibosheth found himself telling the story. The flight from Jerusalem, the nurse who carried him, the fall, the years in Lodabar. When he finished, there was silence around the table. Then David spoke. "You have carried that burden for a long time." Mephibosheth nodded, unsure what to say. "But it does not define you," David continued. "Your legs may be crippled, but your heart is not. Your body may be broken, but your spirit does not have to be." It was such a simple statement, but it landed with the force of revelation. Your legs may be crippled, but your heart is not. Mephibosheth had spent his entire adult life believing that his disability disqualified him from mattering, that his inability to walk properly meant he had nothing to offer, that his brokenness made him less than human. But David was saying something different. David was saying that physical limitation did not equal personal worthlessness, that what was broken in his body did not have to be broken in his identity. That night, for the first time in years, Mephibosheth slept peacefully. The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened in small moments accumulated over weeks and months. It happened when David asked his opinion on a matter and actually listened to his response. It happened when David's sons began to treat him not as a charity case, but as a brother. It happened when he realized he could contribute not through physical labor, but through wisdom, through presence, through being part of something larger than himself. His legs were still crippled. That had not changed. When he walked, he still limped. When he moved, he still struggled. But the way he saw himself began to transform. He was no longer defined by what had been taken from him. He was no longer defined by the fall that had broken his body. He was no longer the forgotten son of a fallen house. He was a guest at the king's table. He was honored. He was provided for. He was loved. Not because he had earned it, not because he was strong or capable or useful, but because the king had made a promise, and the king kept his word. He sent for his wife and son. They came to Jerusalem, uncertain and afraid at first, but David welcomed them warmly. Micah, his son, was given opportunities Mephibosheth had never dreamed possible. The boy could train with weapons. He could learn from the king's advisors. He could grow up free from the fear and shame that had defined his father's life. Watching his son flourish, Mephibosheth felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. This was what grace did. It did not just rescue the individual. It broke cycles. It opened futures. It gave back what had been stolen. Months became years. Mephibosheth's place at the table became permanent. It became normal. The courtier stopped whispering about it. The servants stopped treating him as unusual. He simply was part of the household. And in that normality, in that acceptance, Mephibosheth found something he had never known before. Peace. Chapter 8. Grace that endures. But peace is not the same as the absence of challenge. And the years that followed would test everything Mephibosheth had learned. The kingdom faced new challenges. David's reign, for all its success, was not without turmoil. His family life was complicated. His sons competed for favor, and eventually, inevitably, rebellion came. Absalom, David's son, was ambitious and charismatic. He was also angry at his father, at the way justice had been handled in certain matters, at feeling overlooked. That anger grew into conspiracy. Conspiracy grew into open rebellion. Absalom gathered an army. He positioned himself as the rightful king, the one who would bring justice and order. And shockingly, he gained support. Many in Israel, for various reasons, chose to follow him. David was forced to flee Jerusalem again. Just as he had fled from Saul decades earlier, he now fled from his own son. It was a devastating blow, and it threw the entire kingdom into chaos. The political landscape became treacherous. Loyalties were tested. Old wounds reopened. Those who had been close to David had to make choices. Would they stay with the king in his exile? Or would they hedge their bets, stay in Jerusalem, and see which way the wind blew? In the midst of this chaos, Mephibosheth faced his own crisis. He wanted desperately to go with David. David had saved his life, had given him everything, had shown him mercy beyond measure. Loyalty demanded that he stand with the king, but his legs would not allow it. David and his loyalists were moving quickly, traveling light, prepared to fight if necessary. Mephibosheth could not keep pace. He could not travel on horseback. He could not march with an army. He was once again limited by his body. He made arrangements to follow as quickly as he could. He prepared provisions. He gathered what he needed, but it would take time. He would be behind. He would be slow. And in that window of time, Ziba made his move. Ziba, the servant who had been managing Saul's lands on Mephibosheth's behalf, saw an opportunity. He went to David during the king's flight, bringing donkeys loaded with supplies, bread, wine, fruit. David was grateful. Supplies were desperately needed. "Where is Mephibosheth?" David asked. Ziba's answer was carefully calculated. "He has stayed in Jerusalem. He believes that the house of Israel will restore his grandfather's kingdom to him in the chaos." It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was a believable lie. In times of rebellion, anyone with a royal claim might be tempted to seize power, and Mephibosheth, as Saul's grandson, technically had such a claim. David, exhausted and betrayed on every side, believed Ziba's words. In that moment, surrounded by treachery, it seemed plausible. It seemed like just one more betrayal in a long line of betrayals. He turned to Ziba. "Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." Ziba bowed, hiding his satisfaction. He had gambled and won. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Mephibosheth knew nothing of this conversation. He was still trying to leave, still trying to catch up to David's company, his progress agonizingly slow. When he finally realized he could not reach David in time, when he understood that the king had already left the area and he had no way of knowing where David had gone, Mephibosheth made a decision. And he would wait. He would stay loyal. He would not groom himself, would not wash his clothes, would not present himself as though everything was normal. He would mourn David's absence. He would pray for the king's return, and he would trust that somehow, someday, the truth would be known. The weeks that followed were agony. Absalom controlled Jerusalem. His supporters filled the palace. The city that had become Mephibosheth's home was now occupied by those who opposed the man who had saved him. Every day was a test of faith. Every day required him to trust that David would survive, that David would return, that the grace he had been shown was real and permanent and not dependent on circumstance. Finally, news came. David's forces had won. Absalom was dead. The rebellion was crushed. The king was returning to Jerusalem. Mephibosheth wept with relief. He prepared to meet David, but he did not change his appearance. He had not groomed himself the entire time David was gone. His clothes were unwashed. His hair was unkempt. He looked like what he was, a man in mourning, a man who had refused to accept the new order, a man whose loyalty had never wavered. When David entered Jerusalem, Mephibosheth went out to meet him. He moved as quickly as his legs would allow, pushing through the crowds, desperate to see the king. David saw him coming, and the king's face hardened. "Mephibosheth," David said, his voice cold, "why did you not go with me?" The question hit like a physical blow. Mephibosheth's heart sank. What had happened? Why was David angry? "My lord the king," Mephibosheth said quickly, "my servant deceived me. I intended to come with you. I told him to prepare a donkey so I could ride with you, for your servant is lame. But he left without me, and then he slandered me to you." The pieces began to fall into place. Mephibosheth continued, his words tumbling out. "I know you are wise like an angel of God. I know you see truth. Whatever you decide, I will accept. You saved my life when I had no reason to expect anything but death. If you believe I betrayed you, then judge me. But know this, I have been loyal. I have mourned your absence. I have never stopped believing in you." David looked at him carefully. He saw the unwashed clothes. He saw the unkempt appearance. He saw the evidence of genuine mourning. Ziba had lied clearly, completely, but the situation was complicated. David had already given Mephibosheth's property to Ziba as a reward. And to reverse that completely would be to admit a serious error in judgment. It would be politically messy. It would open questions about David's discernment. David made a decision, perhaps not the perfect one, but a practical one. You and Ziba divide the land between you. It was not full justice, but it was something. It was a recognition that Mephibosheth had been wronged without completely humiliating Ziba or admitting the full extent of the mistake. Mephibosheth's response was immediate and telling. "Let him take it all," he said. "I am just glad my lord the king has returned safely to his house." In that moment, David saw what Mephibosheth had become. This was not the terrified, shame-filled man who had been brought before the throne years earlier. This was not someone clinging desperately to property or status. This was a man who had been transformed by grace, a man who understood that his worth was not tied to what he owned or what he was owed, a man whose identity was secure enough that he could release his rights without losing himself. "Let him take it all. I am just glad you're back." That was the heart of a man who had learned what mercy meant, who had internalized grace so deeply that he could extend it to others, even to someone who had wronged him. David nodded slowly, seeing and understanding. Mephibosheth remained at the king's table. The land was divided as David had decreed, but it barely mattered. What mattered was the relationship. What mattered was the covenant. What mattered was that grace once given had proven itself to be unshakable. Even in political turmoil, even in betrayal and accusation, even when tested by circumstance and misunderstanding, The grace remained because grace is not based on performance. It is based on promise. And David had made a promise to Jonathan that transcended everything else. Epilogue. The table, still set years later when Mephibosheth was an old man. He would sit at David's table and remember. He would remember the fear, the years in Lodabar, the shame that had defined him, the certainty that he would die for the crime of being born into the wrong family. And then he would remember the throne room, the moment when David spoke mercy instead of judgment, the moment when everything changed. His legs never healed. He never walked without difficulty. The scars of his fall remained with him for the rest of his life. When he rose from the table each evening, he still needed assistance. When he moved through the palace, he still limped. But those scars no longer defined him, because grace does not erase the past. It redeems it. Grace does not pretend the pain never happened. It declares that the pain is not the end of the story. Grace does not require perfection. It offers a seat at the table anyway. In the ancient Near East, to eat at a king's table was not a casual thing. It was not just about food. It was a declaration of status. It was a statement of belonging. It was a promise of protection. It meant you were under the king's roof, under his provision, under his care. For Mephibosheth, it meant he was no longer the crippled grandson of a failed king. He was a son of David's household, not by birth, not by right, but by grace. The story of Mephibosheth spread throughout Israel. People told it to their children. They remembered the king who kept his covenant. They remembered the man who had been lifted from hiding and given a place of honor. And in the retelling, the story became more than just history. It became a picture of something deeper, something universal, something that spoke to the human condition itself. Because Mephibosheth's story is not unique in a spiritual sense. It is everyone's story. We are all crippled. Not necessarily physically, but in the ways that matter. We are broken by circumstances beyond our control. We carry shame for things that were not our fault. We hide in barren places because we believe we have nothing to offer. We expect judgment because we cannot imagine mercy. And into that fear, into that shame, into that hiding comes a summons. Come to the table, not because you've earned it, not because you're strong enough or good enough or capable enough, not because you can walk without limping or contribute without limitation. Just come. There is a place set for you. There has always been a place set for you, not because of who you are, but because of who the King is, the King who keeps covenants, the King who remembers the forgotten, the King who looks at broken people and sees not dead dogs, but beloved children. Mephibosheth lived out his days in Jerusalem at David's table, a living testament to grace. His son Micah grew up free from the shame his father had known. The cycle was broken. The curse was lifted. And at the end of his life, when Mephibosheth looked back over the strange and merciful arc of his story, he understood something profound. And the fall that had crippled him had not been the defining moment of his life. The throne room had been the moment when he stopped being defined by his brokenness and started being defined by the King's mercy. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment he stopped being a dead dog and became a son. This is the echo of a greater truth that resonates through all of time. There is a table still being set, not in an ancient palace, but in the heart of God. And at that table there is room for the crippled, the ashamed, the fearful, and the forgotten. There is room for those who believe they are worthless. There is room for those who have been hiding in barren places, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. There is room for those who have been broken by fools they did not choose, for those who carry scars that will never fully heal, for those who move through life with a limp. Grace arrives where shame has settled in, and the invitation is not based on what you can offer. It is not based on your strength or your capability or your worthiness. It is based on a covenant made long before you were born, a promise kept by a king who does not forget. The table is set, the seat is yours, not because you earned it, but because he remembered. There are moments in history that seem unremarkable at first glance. A king makes a decision, a prophet speaks a warning, a door closes quietly on an opportunity that will never return.